A king whose coronation was long overdue. Royalty rocked by family differences. A time of intense division in English society. Yes, that's right. The year is 1660, and today on the History Chronicles we are looking at the reign of King Charles II. King Charles II was crowned on the 28th of May in the year 1660. His coronation marked the end of a decade-long interregnum which had seen his father executed, the English monarchy abolished, and a government arise that was dominated by a new, powerful military elite. Why then was this king, the son of the beheaded Charles I, invited back to England? What was the character of his rule, and why did England avoid returning to republicanism after him? In this episode of the History Chronicles we will explore all of these questions, but let us start with talking about the experiences in the childhood of this young prince who would be king. From the minute of his birth, the young Charles was already rocked by the divisions that had torn through society in 17th century England. His father, who as king had publicly committed to the Anglican Church, had controversially married the French Catholic Henrietta Maria in 1625. Throughout her life, Henrietta Maria was to retain her Catholic beliefs. However, her marriage contract to Charles stipulated that any heirs to the throne were to be raised as Protestant, brought up in the traditions of the Church of England. When Henrietta Maria gave birth to her firstborn son on the 29th of May 1630, he was immediately removed from her care by wet nurses. Such a custom was the norm in 17th century European society. The notable thing about these wet nurses, though, was that they were Protestant. Little Charles's baptism also took place in the rite and custom of the Anglican Church, and he was brought up in these Protestant customs and beliefs by his tutors at court. The young Charles appeared to enjoy as happy a childhood as was possible in 17th century England. His mother wrote that her son was to be bred to wonderful civility. Indeed, later in life his contemporaries were to remark about his good character. One bishop commented that he had a softness and gentleness about him, both in his air and in his expression. He grew up in a family that was remarkably stable for the period. The king, Charles I, remained loyal to his wife, the Catholic Henrietta Maria, just as the Queen was devoted to him. Under the surface, however, tensions were brewing between the king and his people that were to dramatically alter the path of young Charles's childhood. Many in Parliament, that institution that had grown increasingly powerful in England, were becoming more and more distrustful of their king. King Charles I had a staunch belief in his own royal prerogative that allowed him to rule with or without the necessary consent of any elected body. Many members of Parliament began to criticise Charles's policies regarding how England operated abroad and, at home, how he taxed the realm with large sums to pay for his navy. Perhaps the most crucial issue here, though, was the mistrust surrounding Charles regarding the issue of religion. Since the early 1500s, Protestant ideas had seeped into Christian circles in England and had, by the reign of Henry VIII, seen the king pronounce doctrine that challenged established practices of the Catholic Church. A series of toing and froing continued on the Catholic-Protestant divide under subsequent monarchs. By the reign of Charles I, this had resulted in the Church of England straddling a precarious middle way between the various Protestant denominations and Catholic practices. That said, more extremist Protestant denominations, such as Puritanism, had grown popular in many parts of England and Scotland. Puritans were dissatisfied with the extent of the Reformation in England and wanted it to go further, purging any remaining Catholic or so-called Papist practices out of the Church's identity. Closely allied to the Puritans were the Scottish Presbyterians, who also voiced their hostility to Catholic doctrine. Charles I had committed himself to lead the Anglican Church, as was the custom for kings and queens of England since Henry VIII. But many suspected that Charles hid his real faith, Catholicism. He was, after all, married to a Catholic in Henrietta Maria and, in his religious policy, tended to favour those who were regarded as Papists, supporters of the Pope, in the Anglican Church. One such example is Charles's support of William Laud. Laud had baptised his baby boy, Charles, and had gone on to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, the clerical head of the Church of England. In this position he had worked to purge the English Church of its more Protestant tendencies and celebrated the Church's continuity with its Catholic past before the Reformation. Many members of Parliament, several Puritans among them, were incensed at Laud's reforms of the Church of England. The situation was exacerbated in 1629 when the king suspended Parliament for the third time in 4 years. Soon, this was to lead to a decade-long civil war, with the king on one side and many of his former Parliament on the other. The young boy Charles was only 10 years old when he found himself sitting on the fringes of one of the key battles in the English Civil War. The king brought his son with him to face the Parliamentarian army at the Battle of Edgehill. On the morning of the battle, young Charles, now with the title Prince of Wales, and his brother were under the charge of the royal physician, Dr. William Harvey. Harvey didn't seem too concerned about the danger the boys were in, as he took out a book to read, only moving locations when a cannonball bounced past the ground beside him. The group took shelter in a field, then got separated from the main body of the royalist forces. In the haze of battle, they then approached a group of soldiers who looked to be like supporters of the king. As they drew closer, however, it became clear that these were parliamentarian soldiers. The story goes that the boys charged Dr. Harvey begged them to run away, but Charles drew his pistol. "I fear them not," he cried, and prepared to charge into battle. Fortunately for the young prince in his group, a royalist cavalryman appeared to charge down the parliamentary soldier that was headed their way. Charles was spared the need to participate in battle for now. The Battle of Edgehill ended up being a draw between the king and the parliamentarian forces, but as the years drew on, it was clear that the civil war was not going the king's way. The king had his heir first confined to the royalist city of Oxford, but soon after to the port of Bristol in the west of England. Here young Charles was made the titular head of the royalist forces in the case of the king's death or capture. It wasn't long, however, before this region of the country too fell to parliamentarian support. The young Charles fled further, now across to the Isle of Scilly, then to Jersey in the Channel Islands, and finally to his mother in France in the spring of 1646. In August of the same year, his father, Charles I, surrendered into parliamentarian captivity. From France, the young Charles moved to The Hague in the Netherlands as a new stage of the English Civil War erupted with a Scottish invasion of England, supported by royalist uprisings across the country. Here, it was hoped, he could gain support for the royalist army from his brother-in-law, William, the Prince of Orange. This, along with diplomatic efforts to save the king's fledgling cause, however, were to end in failure. Charles's father was executed on the orders of Parliament on the 30th of January 1649. Parliament also passed a measure stating that no person whatsoever should presume to declare Charles Stuart, son of the late Charles, to be King of England and Ireland. It wasn't until the 5th of February that young Charles heard of his father's death. When his chaplain informed him of the news, it was reported that he broke down into bitter weeping. His father had been crowned King of all England, Scotland and Ireland, but on the 16th of February 1649, it was only on the small island of Jersey in the English Channel that people proclaimed Charles II's coronation. England was now a republic. In Scotland, however, Charles II had some allies. The Covenanter Parliament in Scotland, so called because of its Presbyterian beliefs, sought to protect the rights and freedoms of their church. The Reformation in Scotland had been even more radical in its hostility to Catholicism than it had been in England. The doctrine that had emerged to dominate the Scottish Church, that of Calvinism, advocated a staunch belief in the importance of Scripture over the traditions of the Church, and man's binding by the covenant of works and of grace. If Charles II was to be admitted to Scotland, the Covenanters argued, then he must pledge to advocate such beliefs in all of his kingdoms. Such a deal was far from Charles's hopes. His mother was Catholic, and his own father had fostered a religious policy that sympathised with some Catholic practices. After a failed attempt at forcing a more palatable agreement, however, Charles had little option but to accept the demands of the Scots. He arrived in Scotland on the 23rd of June 1650 and formally agreed to support the Solemn League and Covenant that promoted Presbyterianism across England, Scotland and Ireland. While this gained him some headway among the Scots and a foothold once more into the British Isles, such a move was met with scathing distaste by the Puritans back in England. What made it worse was that the Covenanter Scots now raised an army, hoping to invade England and place their puppet king, the young Charles, on the throne. Oliver Cromwell, at the head of Parliament's new model army, moved in a preemptive strike against the king's position in Scotland. His army met the Scots at Dunbar in a night attack on the 3rd of September 1650. A massive defeat was inflicted on the Scots that made the Covenanter army a spent force. Back in his castle at Perth, Charles II was reportedly secretly pleased that his Scottish allies had met with such an end. He would no longer be required to enforce Presbyterianism on the land. However, he now faced the choice of surrender to Cromwell's unsympathetic English army, or gather his own royalist supporters to face down the English in battle. He chose the latter option. Unfortunately for Charles, however, few royalist supporters flocked to his cause. His outnumbered army was defeated in another masterstroke by Cromwell in Worcester in 1651. Upon his retreat, sources say that Charles stripped off his armour and called to his men, "I would rather you shoot me than let me live to see the consequences of this day." Charles escaped, but now he had to flee to France once more. So rushed was his retreat that he shed his entourage and his royal garb, dressing as a lowly country peasant as he made his way to the English coast. The only possessions that he insisted on keeping were his royal socks. Charles arrived at the French court in Paris in October 1651. Here again he was forced to live off the charity of his mother, Henrietta Maria, aunt of the French king. Back in England, Oliver Cromwell now ruled as Lord Protector in what had become a military dictatorship. Charles's position was weakened further when the French monarch, himself in search of allies to strengthen his position on the throne, made an alliance with the Cromwellian government in England. Charles now turned to Spain for support and moved his court to the Netherlands, which at this time was part of the Spanish Empire. He brokered a deal that afforded him Spanish support in return for his help in Spain's own war against France in 1656. This, though, came to little when Charles's small army foundered against the larger forces of England and France on the shores of Dunkirk. Once again, the young Charles could not have his kingdom. But perhaps he no longer needed to try as hard. The year 1658 saw the death of Oliver Cromwell and the succession of his son Richard to power in England. Richard Cromwell lacked the experience and credibility of his father, and, quickly, the firm hand that had led the English government thus far faded away. Richard resigned from his position in 1659, and England was left to the charge of squabbling commanders of the new model army. One of these commanders, General George Monk, marched down from his base in Scotland to London to force a general election, the first in 20 years. The new parliament that was elected, the so-called Convention Parliament, included enough royalist supporters to welcome the king's return. Monk too appeared to favour such a gamble. He had contacted Charles with a secret message in 1660, asking the conditions of his return. Charles responded with a document called the Declaration of Breda. Crucially, Charles found it in himself to forgive the crimes of Parliament and the treason that had taken place in the previous decade. "We look on you as wise and dispassionate men and good patriots who will raise up those banks and fences that have been cast down." Charles wrote of the need for Parliament. He affirmed the vital role that it would play in any future government that he was to form. He forgave those who had played a role in the execution of his father. On the significant issue of religion, Charles declared that no one should be disquieted or called into question for their religious opinions. On the 1st of May, the Declaration of Breda was read aloud to the House of Commons. The very next day, Parliament passed a resolution that welcomed Charles back to England. Charles landed at Dover on England's coast in May 1660 and was crowned king on the 23rd of April 1661. Parliament had proclaimed that he had been the lawful king since the death of his father on the 30th of January 1649. It was 11 years and 84 days until he could officially enact his role as England's monarch. For the rest of his life, he would never step outside England again. Charles's coronation appears to have been a happy day. As tradition dictated, he trod the same route from the Tower of London to Whitehall as medieval kings had done. En route he passed under arches of rebellion and confusion, blatant symbolism to demonstrate the king as being at the centre of stability and order. The Coronation Medal featured a royal oak bursting into leaf, encapsulating the king's motto, Iam Florissit, Now it flourishes. Only days after his coronation, Charles opened a new parliament. This one, he said, he was to keep until their beards grew long. The new parliament was indeed a favourable one. Like the Convention Parliament, it consisted of MPs of an overwhelmingly royalist proportion and has been labelled the Cavalier Parliament as a result. This was a long parliament too, lasting 17 years until the king was to call another one, well within his powers at the time, in 1679. But now the king was back. How was he to rule? The question of religion, which had so troubled his father's reign, was to be one of Charles's priorities. Contrary to his actions in Scotland in the 1650s, Charles acted to strengthen the Church of England and discourage any who did not conform to the Anglican expression of belief. The Act of Uniformity, passed in 1662, made the Anglican Book of Common Prayer compulsory in all religious services in the realm. The Conventicle Act in 1664 prevented religious assemblies of more than 5 people outside of the auspices of the Church of England. Non-conformist clergy were expelled from the church and banned from coming within 5 miles of the parish where they had worked. Charles was evidently keen to nip the religious problem in the bud before it blossomed once more. Puritanism also appeared to be on the decline in England. Theatres which had been closed under the Cromwellian government were reopened under Charles, and society responded favourably to the resumption of other church festivities that had been restricted, such as the celebration of Christmas. There was one problem, however, in the form of Charles's brother. James, the Duke of York, had also spent time in France during the English Civil War. During this time he had been drawn ever closer to the Catholic faith and converted to the religion secretly in 1668. Parliament grew suspicious of James at court and the possibility of renewed Catholic influence under the king. They passed a Test Act in 1673 that made all civil and military officials take an oath to disavow Catholic doctrine and denounce practices of the Catholic Church. James refused to swear this oath, and in 1673 his conversion was made therefore public. The widowed James then went on to marry a 15-year-old Italian princess. This event was condemned by Parliament not for the girl's age, but rather because she too was a Catholic. Charles II had little choice but to oppose his brother's conversion. What made matters worse for Charles was that he was childless. The future of the monarchy appeared to reside in his Catholic brother and his children. That was something that Parliament would not tolerate. In 1677, Charles therefore arranged for James's daughter Mary to marry William III, the Prince of Orange, the Protestant ruler of the Netherlands. Still, this arrangement failed to stave off the growing fears among the English public of a Catholic plot to take over the throne. Parliament was on the cusp of passing an exclusion bill, which would remove James and his children from any inheritance rights to the throne. It was then that Charles intervened. For the first time in 17 years, he dissolved Parliament. With his brother at the centre of what had become a huge public scandal, he ordered James to Brussels. Here James, the Duke of York, would play a lesser role in English politics, and the flames of hostility could die down. Charles's problems with Parliament, though, went beyond those of his brother. In 1672 he issued the Royal Declaration Indulgence, which suspended the persecution of Catholics and other dissenters in England. Even within the largely royalist Cavalier Parliament, such a move that seemingly expressed open tolerance to Catholicism was regarded unfavourably. In this issue, the king was forced to back down and renounce his plans. Charles again invoked the ire of Parliament in his open support of Catholic France against the Protestant Dutch Republic. This war against the Dutch kicked off in 1672 and saw England become embroiled in a conflict that was to last for 2 years. The war gained little for England and served only to drain the country's coffers and highlight the weaknesses in its navy. In 1674, Parliament refused to grant the king more funds for this conflict, and he was forced to make peace with the Dutch. While Charles may have struggled in aspects of his foreign policy, his reign is more fondly remembered for his contributions towards science and learning in the kingdom. On a personal level, Charles II was a highly educated individual who, even as king, managed to find time to practice astronomy and other scientific pursuits. He was particularly fascinated by the navy and was able to engage in learned discussions on ship design with the diarist Samuel Pepys. With England's involvement in the Anglo-Dutch War going awry, Charles was unhappy with the state of the country's navy and sought to improve England's capacity to express its power at sea. He promoted research into navigation with the foundation of the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, an act that was to become central to the discovery of longitude in years to come. Charles also encouraged a new generation of navigators to rise up with the foundation of the Royal Mathematical School at Christ's Hospital in 1673. This allowed pupils as young as 11 or 12 to be selected and funded through schooling that would prepare them for a career in the Royal Navy. On a national level, Charles granted a group of scientists a royal charter to develop their work in a formal society in 1662. This, the foundation of England's Royal Society, was a significant step forward in the science community in England. The Royal Society would eventually see some of the basic laws of physics established in Charles's own lifetime. Despite Charles's scientific interest and humanist leanings, however, he remained an absolute monarch. Charles dissolved Parliament when its actions had not suited him over his brother during the Exclusion Crisis. When a new Parliament was convened, it lasted only a few days before it too was dissolved. From 1681 until his death in 1685, Charles II ruled without Parliament. Yet, unlike his father, he maintained his authority. Why? In 1683, a Protestant plan to murder the king and his brother as they returned from the horse races in Newmarket was uncovered. Its conspirators, the Earl of Essex and 3 other noblemen, were condemned for their plan. One committed suicide, another went into exile, and another 2 were executed. Contrary to what the plot had hoped to achieve, the notion of a return to the turmoil of the Civil War and Commonwealth evidently frightened many in England. Charles saw a surge in popularity. With his enemies in Parliament and the judiciary, he was similarly ruthless. He disenfranchised many of his parliamentary opponents in local elections of 1682, and, in these latter years of his reign, he replaced judges and sheriffs with his own favoured candidates at will. Early in 1685, Charles fell suddenly and gravely ill. He was only 54. Some suspected poison, given the enemies he had made in some circles. What seems a more likely candidate, however, is that Charles's own science experiments were one of the factors behind his sudden illness. In the days before, he had been experimenting with mercury, the poisonous substance which causes severe kidney damage. He had also engaged in bloodletting, and had exhibited signs that would today be interpreted as kidney dysfunction. As he lay dying, Charles was to perform one last but religiously explosive act. With a Catholic priest at his bedside, he took communion, and was received into the Catholic Church. "I am most heartily sorry," gasped Charles, "that I have delayed my reconciliation so long." Charles's doctors continued to bleed him in a series of last desperate treatments before his final hours came. On the morning of Friday, the 6th of February, as the sun rose over the Thames, he asked the curtains to be drawn. By lunchtime, the king had died. The best of Christians as the best of kings. By him such blessings to his realms were given. He seemed created for the people's good. Such was the judgment of one commentator, the Irish priest Edmund R. Walker, on the king's death in 1685. By the very end of his reign, Charles's own Catholic persuasion was plain to see. His brother, the Catholic James II, was to be his heir and would rule a kingdom that would once again be plagued by religious division. But for much of his life in power, Charles had put his own religious preferences aside. He had seen his father's regime crumble and die. He had then seen his own attempts to regain his throne end in dismal failure. When he was at last restored to his kingdom, he was determined to cling on to it. In power, his shortcomings were evident, but he nevertheless kept control of both his family and of Parliament. In most reports he was of good character, and, for all of his failings, he proved to be a popular monarch. This mood emerges in words written by the Marquis of Halifax, who had been a critic of the king. In them, we get a glimpse into the personality of King Charles II that someone who knew him personally wished to preserve. "Let his royal ashes then lie soft upon, and cover him from harsh and unkind censures, which, though they should not be unjust, can never clear themselves of being indecent." Thank you for watching this episode of the History Chronicles. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Please do like, subscribe, support us on Patreon if you can, and join us again for some more history.